You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. Dapper Dinosaur here. Recently, I've become interested in what the people in the pews in creationist churches are learning. That's why I did a series on Carl Kirby. But I also want to see what people in smaller, less affluent churches are hearing. This is because, while responding to the PhD in professional creationists is awesome, and I have no plan to stop doing that, they're making arguments that I'm not sure are filtering down to the creationists on the street, if you will. This talk is from a church called Calvary Chapel. It's not actually far from me, at about 3 hours' drive. It's in the beautiful Arizona highlands, about equidistant from the Navajo Nation, Fort Apache Reservation, and Phoenix. If you think of Arizona as just a bunch of sun-scorched rock and cacti, then go visit the highlands. They're full of lakes, pine trees, deer, and wonderful campgrounds. Just don't speed there because those roads are on cliffs and it's a long way down. Anyway, this is presumably a sermon called 8 Ways Science Verifies Biblical Creation as Superior to Secular Science, and this is from October 11th, 2020, given by Pete Greer. Pete Greer is associated with the Foundation Ministry and has a master's from Northern Arizona University in physical education with a biology minor, and he also seems to have taken some graduate courses in biology. Although, as we'll see, it seemed not to seep in. Anyway, take it away, Pete.
I'm just trying to give you an overview of the biblical view of that science verifies the biblical view.
I know I harp on this a lot, but this is not the biblical view with a capital T. It's a biblical view, sure, but it's a minority view, and the fact that other people disagree with Pete doesn't mean they aren't serious about their religion or the Bible. People can honestly look at the text of Genesis and interpret its meaning and intent differently. And not to go all postmodern on y'all, but when people do that, it's hard to say one of them is objectively right and the other wrong. Now, in terms of the science, that's easier, but here we're just talking about what you think the Bible actually says about things like creation. After this, there's a quick prayer. I'm cutting it out because I have no response to it. I also cut out some autobiographical details.
But the reason I like to share this information is because I believe that our culture has been held captive by a theory that has no scientific credence.
It's got nearly 100% scientific credence, but I think he may have meant credibility, which it also has a lot of. But I can see why someone who doesn't believe in an idea would say that it lacks credibility. It's almost necessary to think that those things you think are incorrect are incredible, in the literal sense. Now, I'm going to give something as a useful heuristic. There is simply too much to know for any one person to be an expert in more than a handful of things. And if you want to rise to the level of a well-informed layperson, you are still going to have to restrict that to a limited number of areas. For example, I am quite ill-informed about sports ball, Chinese history, algal systematics, etc., etc. So what do we do when something we don't know becomes important? Well, we go to people who do know what they're talking about. The people who have dedicated their time and energy to become experts. So when you need medical advice, you go to a doctor. And if you're in doubt about the diagnosis or advice you get, you go to a different doctor to get a second opinion. The more opinions from experts you get that all agree, the more confidence you have in that conclusion. Now, does that logically make this opinion right? No, it doesn't. But experts that reach a consensus generally do so for a good reason. And if you lack expertise, your best bet is to assume that they are at least largely correct. This remains true in biology. Essentially, all the experts agree that evolution is the only theory of biodiversity and the only model that explains the patterns we see in morphology, genetics, and the fossil record. And a person without expertise is unlikely to be able to overturn that paradigm.
I'll be discussing that later, but our scriptures tell us, beware lest any man cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ.
Let's pull back from that verse and read a bit more context. This is the English Standard Version of Colossians 2, 6-10.
Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority.
At this point, the author goes on about how Jesus is the Savior, and then gets to this bit in verses 16-19.
Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God.
This section of Colossians is about maintaining a high Christology in the face of people who might say that Jesus was not fully divine, as well as telling the Colossians not to worry about the details of Mosaic dietary laws and fasting rules. It's certainly not a warning that you must adhere to a literal interpretation of Genesis.
And that's exactly what the theory of evolution has done. It's a philosophy, it's deceitful.
Evolution is a scientific theory. It's not capable of deceit, because deceit is a willful attempt to deceive a person or persons. Proponents of evolution might be deceitful, but evolution cannot be. It's not really a philosophy, it's a scientific theory explaining the patterns of biodiversity we see now and in the past. Now, sure, it rests, as does all science, on certain aspects of philosophy of science, but it's no more a philosophy than the theory of general relativity is.
And it's according to the tradition of men, and it's not according to Christ.
Well, it was certainly created by humans, and none of those humans were Jesus, near as I can tell. But like I said, that's also true of other theories, like the germ theory of disease. Nowhere in the biblical text can we get a clear idea that infectious diseases are caused by microbes, and that killing such microbes can prevent or cure disease. But despite this, most Christians will still take antibiotics to cure their strep throat.
So I want to come against that today. I want to come to you and speak the words of truth so that you can have full confidence in the Word of God. Did you know that 70% of our youth from evangelical Christian homes are leaving the church when they go to high school and college? 70%.
Maybe you should stop telling them that to stay Christians, they have to believe obvious nonsense like anti-evolution claptrap. Just a thought.
And I believe one of the reasons is we haven't trained them in this area, because they go to school, they go to their science classes, and they get called idiots for believing in the fairy tales that are in the Bible.
Couple things. First, they absolutely should not be called idiots for this. If anyone is doing that, it is not okay, especially if it's school staff doing it. Kids in school accept what they have been taught by and large, at least until they get to some higher education, where they will start to begin to really do the work of verifying things on their own. A kid who has been taught anti-science nonsense isn't stupid, he or she is ignorant, and that's important. Second, I have the opposite take, because I have talked to too many people who realized that the professional creationists were lying to them, and that caused them to embark on a journey that ended with them abandoning Christianity altogether. Not always religion, but Christianity at least. In fact, of the former young earth creationists I know, some of whom were extremely well versed in the creationist literature, former Christians outnumber Christians considerably. Now, I know both myself and Pete here are using anecdotal evidence, but I would love to see a study on this, and based on what I've heard about polls of young people leaving the church, the science is a big part of it for a lot of them. And obstinately being wrong about it isn't doing the churches any favor.
I must mention that Dr. Rick Oliver,
So Dr. Rick Oliver is yet another scientist who reconverted to Christianity for reasons not related to being convinced of young earth creationism, then decided to change his mind about evolution. His testimony is linked in the description. He even starts out by dismissing the importance of evidence. Once you decide that evidence doesn't matter, you're no longer doing science.
I traveled with him for 3.5 months in 2010. He's got a PhD in evolutionary biology. He got that because he wanted to prove his mom wrong about the Bible.
That's certainly not the introduction he gave, and according to himself, for years he was a jerk to Christians and gave them bad grades. So it's not like he got his PhD and realized how stupid evolution was. It seems more like he decided it was stupid after deciding evidence was not important.
And he travels the country teaching creation science now. He was actually flying into that area right there. That's Mount St. Helens. He was flying in there on a helicopter to relieve a person on that post that was reading the seismograph and everything when the mountain blew. And he's got a great testimony. His website will be up there at the end where you can go there and see his teachings. It was an awesome thing, but he verified all the things I had been learning for 7 years up to that point. He verified it, so I can feel confident I'm teaching you the truth both biblically and what's happening in the real world in science.
Having a man who self-admittedly doesn't care about evidence teach you is about the same as just not being taught. Maybe I'll do something on Rick Oliver. If you like that, let me know in the comments.
So this is a jail cell I took a picture of on that trip. It's in a park in Wilsey, Kansas. And the thought occurred to me, you know, when you're in that jail cell, you know you're in that jail cell. There's no doubt about it. You're not getting out of that jail cell. But There's so many people in our culture that have been taken captive by this theory of evolution that they think is disproven the Bible, and they don't even know that they're being held captive.
It's almost like if you base your theology on the idea that a literal interpretation of Genesis must be true, that when people learn it's not, they then have to decide that your religion is nonsense too. Pete doesn't have to go down that route, but I guess he just really wants to be wrong.
And I'm going to show you today how that belief and the fact that they close their eyes to any opposing viewpoint and just call it unscientific, out of hand, how that's wrong, how that hurts their research, how it hurts them on their outlook towards their science that they're doing. There's a war of the worldview in our culture. There's God's word.
And demonstrably true physical reality. I'm sure that's what he's about to say next.
And there's man's word.
Yeah, humans didn't make up the universe. And while they did invent science, it doesn't depend on their ideas to be useful. Science works. It makes predictions which can be and are confirmed. This includes evolutionary biology. It's not man's word in any sense other than the description of what is evident in nature. If God didn't want us to believe in evolution, he shouldn't have arranged everything so that it either does not contradict or actively supports the theory.
Materialism, evolution, naturalism all fall under that category.
Well, evolution is only naturalistic and materialistic in the sense that it concerns the natural and material world. It doesn't require one to be philosophically naturalistic or materialistic. And that's true of all theories in science. Science is about the natural and material world. But you can be a supernaturalist and still accept and do good science.
We have this battle, and it seems to be over the evidence. You know, some people think it's over the evidence. We say it's for creation. No, they say it's for evolution. But the truth of the matter is we all have the same evidence.
I'm here going to refer my audience to the book The Rocks Were There by my friends Jackson Wheat and R.J. Downard. It is an 825-page tome that is expected to be part 1 of at least 2, with the second part being of comparable size. And essentially the whole thing is a catalog of creationists ignoring evidence that they don't like. Creationists notoriously ignore huge swaths of the data that they find inconvenient. Let me give an example. I'll turn to a random page on The Rocks Were There. Page 200 starts with an examination of creationist takes on Linsky's long-term E. coli experiments. It notes 52 sources relevant to creationist claims that are simply ignored by creationists, and notes that they rely on only 13 sources, of which several were not actually peer-reviewed, but published in creationist rags, and those that were not were often mischaracterized. This is not an isolated problem. In another work, Evolution Slam Dunk, author R.J. Downard goes through the stunning amount of ignored data on the evolution of mammals from basal synapsids, in which creationists barely even touch on the evidence, and even when they do, they ignore almost all of it. In fact, Downard has calculated that, at a rough estimate, creationists tend to exclude 90% or more of the relevant data at any time when they bother to touch on any scientific subject. It's not that we have the same evidence, it's that science has the evidence and creationists just pretend that almost all of it doesn't exist, focusing just on the bits that they find easiest to spin. If you're interested in either book, links are in the description.
The layers at the Grand Canyon are the layers of the Grand Canyon for both sides. They're there. We look at them. We use our worldview to interpret them. So they interpret it as a lot of time and a little bit of water.
More like a lot of time and a lot of water. Remember, many layers of the Grand Canyon are marine, meaning they were under the ocean. That's a lot of water.
And I interpret it, and the Bible interprets it, a lot of water and a little bit of time through the flood of Noah.
The Bible doesn't mention anything about geology at all, except I guess for the bare existence of things like mountains. Because the authors of the Bible didn't really know anything about geology. Because basically no one did until the modern period. Sure, people realized that here and there volcanoes caused new rock or that earthquakes could shift rock, but there was no real idea about sedimentation, lithification, the rock cycle, etc. until well into the modern period. In fact, even a passing knowledge of geology reveals that a global flood cannot be responsible for the geology of Earth, which includes things like aeolian sandstone, subaerial tuff, and evaporites, none of which can form under a flood. But further, it includes things like hundreds of meter thick limestone and coral layers, which take longer to form than young Earth creationists think the Earth has been around. And that's under optimum deposition conditions.
So the same evidence is there, and so what we want to learn to do is look at it from a biblical worldview. Creation scientists and evolutionists both use operational science. The scientific method is the same. Doesn't matter what your presuppositional position is, we still do the laboratory science the same.
Let's check on that. First, let's go to Andrew Snelling, a man I've called the most dishonest creationist I know of. You see, he's Answers in Genesis' pet apologist, and he is the main source for their claim that the rocks from the Paleozoic and Mesozoic are all flood rocks, but the Precambrian and Cenozoic rocks are not. So pre-flood and post-flood respectively. But then in order to show the necessity of floods to make fossils, he will present Precambrian and Cenozoic fossils. Also, and perhaps more seriously, he will describe folded sediments as lacking fractures, but then to evidence this, he will use low-res pictures of folded rock strata with people standing in front of the largest fractures. That's not the same science as secular geologists use, as can be seen from high-resolution, sharply focused images from the U.S. Geological Survey, which flatly contradict this claim. Or how about we turn to Steve Austin, who sent multiple samples to a lab in Boston, where he knew, because it was on their website, that they could not meaningfully date his samples. And when he got his samples back with ages of about 200,000 years, the minimum age the lab could return, he crowed about it as if measuring a grain of rice on a truck scale that gives a minimum weight of 1 ton would somehow solve world hunger because each grain of rice weighs a ton. And then the one date that he got back that was beyond the minimum the lab could return was in the one sample with visible crystals in his own paper that are consistent with xenocrysts, which are older crystals in volcanic rock that, if included in a dating attempt, will skew the age old. What did Austin do to show that these were not xenocrysts? Basically just said, trust me, bro. That's not how science is done. It is blatantly dishonest in both cases and disqualifies it from being science. And I should note that neither of these things depend on our assumptions about the history of the world. Both these men deliberately did bad work designed to get to the conclusion they wanted regardless of how old the Earth is or how biodiversity came about. And of course, if you want to keep seeing me take things like that apart, do make sure you like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Now, after that ham-fisted segue, let's get back to Pete Greer.
We test it, we collect data, we report it, we have peers review what we find to see if it looks good or not, and both sides do that.
The problem is that creationist peer review doesn't really exist. There's a hollow mockery of peer review, but not actual peer review. For one thing, creationist so-called journals will refuse to publish findings that contradict their predetermined conclusions. Right there, that's enough to remove them from the category of peer-reviewed journal, because peer review isn't about whether you agree with the conclusion of the paper, it's about whether the work was good as far as the peer reviewer can tell, even if the conclusion is wrong or the reviewer doesn't agree with it. Next, the review and editorial staff of these journals is woefully inadequate. For example, as far as I can find, their Answers research journal, the supposedly scholarly publication of AIG, has as its only editor Andrew Snelling, and as an example of the lack of integrity there, they still have, to this day, as far as I know, not published any retraction of a work by Dr. Tompkins on human chimp DNA, despite the result being wrong because of high school level math errors by Tompkins, as pointed out by Glenn Williamson, who submitted a correction. That correction has been metaphorically sitting on Snelling's desk for years now, neither rejected nor published. Creationists are doing science the way science is done on Star Trek, for pretend and just to serve a narrative.
Where we differ is on the historical science, when we look back in the past, because both creation and the beginnings of life and the earth for evolution happened before man was there to observe it.
Well, since according to a literal take on Genesis, humans are the last creation God seems to make, that's not a difference, that's a commonality.
And so we have to rely on historical science, gather evidence, try to interpret it the best that we can to see which view has the most veracity. And I believe you'll see today that our creation science has a lot of truth to it.
I do like that Pete isn't just dismissing the idea that science can effectively investigate the past. That is not always the case, and I wonder if it is because he is not connected to one of the big organizations, which typically say that scientific investigation of past events is essentially entirely dependent on untestable presuppositions, and can't really be trusted. Of course, they don't tend to extend this to things like forensic science and criminal investigations, but, oh well, creationism has never been completely consistent.
So these are the 8 topics. I'm not going to go over them. We're going to go through them one by one, but I want to restate that each of these are an individual talk that we're just going to hit the highlights of this morning. I want to get people's interest who have never gone there and heard this before.
Awesome, that's what I'm looking for. An overview of what a young Earth churchgoer will get during a sermon on the topic.
For those of you who have been here for years and you've heard the expanded talks, this is a review for you, okay? So get it fresh in your minds. And for anybody who's never heard this before, please just listen with an open mind and weigh what you hear. So the first one is the biblical concept of one kind or family of living organisms can only reproduce other members of that kind.
Ah, the most used word in creationism that's never been given a useful definition. As most of my viewers know, there's no way to know if anything has crossed the boundary into another kind, because those boundaries were never defined, so this is meaningless.
All right? This is found in Genesis chapter 1, that everything reproduces after its own kind. So, what do dogs have when they have babies? And everybody from 3 years old and up or less will tell me they have puppies, which are dogs.
Okay, but in addition to being members of Canis lupus familiaris, they're members of the wider species, C. lupus, which includes the gray wolf, the Arctic wolf, etc. Additionally, they're part of the genus Canis, which includes animals like C. latrans, the coyote, C. aureus, the golden jackal, and C. lupaster, the African wolf. But also, they're part of the subfamily Caninae, which also includes other genera such as Lycaon, Vulpes, Nycteriutis, and Chrysocyon. But they're also in the family Canidae, that includes now extinct animals like the Borophagine or bone-crushing dogs. But they're also in the superfamily Canoidea, and the infraorder Cynoidea, and the suborder Caniforma, and the order Carnivora, which falls into the clades Carnivoriformes and Carnivoromorpha. But they also fall into the clade Pancarnivora, which itself is part of Ferae, which lumps in pangolins with dogs. But from there we get to Pharyngulata, which also includes horses. Then we get to Lorisitheria, which includes hedgehogs. And from there, Loricitherians are also in Boreoeutheria, which includes humans and mice. And Boreoeutheria is in Eutheria, which includes elephants. And Eutheria is in Theria, which includes kangaroos. And Eutheria is in Mammalia, which also includes the platypus. And Mammalia also includes a bunch of fossil things you've never heard of. But Mammalia is in Mammaliformes, with organisms like Morganucodon, and Mammaliformes is in Mammalomorpha, with things like Adelobacillus. And Mammalomorpha is inside Probanignathia, with Probanignathus, which is in Cynodontia with animals like Triachodon, and Cynodontia is in Therapsida with animals like Moschops and Gorgonops, and that's in Sphenacodontia, which includes things like Edaphosaurus and Dimetrodon, and Sphenacodontia is in Synapsida, which also includes things like Archaeorhynthus. But Synapsida is in Amniota with birds, and Amniota is in Tetrapoda with salamanders, and Tetrapoda is in Stegocephalia with Tiktaalik, and Stegocephalia is in Rhipidistia with the lungfish, and Rhipidistia is within Sarcopterygii with the coelacanths, and Sarcopterygii is within Osteichthyes with the carp, and Osteichthyes is in Gnathostomata with the shark, and that's within Vertebrata with the lamprey, and that's within Chordata with the tunicate, and Chordata is within Deuterostomia with the starfish, and Deuterostomia is within Nephrozoa with the squid, and Nephrozoa is within Bilateria with the flatworm, and Bilateria is within Eumetazoa with the jellyfish, and Eumetazoa is within Metazoa, which includes sponges, and Metazoa is within Holozoa, which includes the single-celled choanoflagellates, and Holozoa is in Opisthokonta, along with mushrooms, and Opisthokonta is within Eukarya, along with pine trees, and only at this point does the tree of life start to get tangled going back in time. And the same ways that we put dog into a subspecies of the gray wolf is the same way we put all organisms into all higher classifications. The task of creationism is to show where we went wrong, where, no, the higher classification is not an objective fact of ancestry, but simply an arbitrary human convention. And by the way, I left out dozens of clades, both named and unnamed, which have been discovered by science. Mostly because they didn't have members that most people would recognize that I hadn't already named.
Well, dogs do change. We have many different varieties of dogs. All the varieties of dogs today came from probably one wolf-like pair that came off the ark.
Nope. There is too much diversity within just the wolf alone, let alone the whole genus Canis, to be explained from one breeding pair coming off the ark.
And through natural and artificial selection, we've come up with all different kinds, not kinds, but species, man's named them species of dogs.
I'm curious to see if he keeps the kind at the genus level, or if he moves it up to the family level like most creationists. And
we've even got it where we've bred out so much information that we ended up with a Chihuahua.
There is no objective way to measure information in an organism that results in a Chihuahua having less information than some other dog. I mean, the implication seems to be that being small means you have less information. So do the Baka people of Central Africa have less information than the Dutch? I mean, the Baka have the shortest average height of known people groups, and the Dutch the highest. Somehow, I don't think Pete would be okay with saying that the Baka have had information bred out of them, while the Dutch maintain much more information from Adam and Eve. But that's the implication of saying that the Chihuahua has low information compared to a wolf, since the Chihuahua has all the same bones and organs as a wolf, and even has more muscles in its face than a wolf. Now, if there's a reason for saying that other than size, I'd love to know, but it's the only obvious difference between Chihuahuas and other members of the genus Canis that I see.
It's a dog, but it's almost a mouse.
Well, since it's no more like a mouse than it is like a chimpanzee, I'm going to have to assume that this is confirmation that yes, we are talking about size. And also, by what other metric could we say that a mouse has less information than a wolf? I don't know. I guess just gross size correlates with information, so blue whales must have the most information, despite the fact that the largest known genome belongs to an amoeba, which must have very little information because it's small.
But it will never be a mouse. It'll always be a dog. It can never be anything besides a dog because that's the genetics that God gave it.
Okay, but evolution also precludes a dog from becoming a mouse, even if it occupies the same niche as a mouse. It can become mouse-like superficially, but you can't cross over into another group in evolution. You can only start new groups within older, larger groups. This is called monophily. You can't escape your ancestry. And since both mice and dogs have ancestry that's independent at about the level of Boreoeutheria, they can't become each other. It would be like your sister becoming your third cousin. Assuming no inbreeding, that just is not how it works.
And we've never seen an example of that being violated yet in observational science.
Yes, and if we saw that, it would violate both evolutionary biology and creationism. So no one expects to see that.
So if evolution is true, we should find transitional creatures. I'm going to show you some fictional ones. But guess what? They're just as accurate as the ones that were in my biology book when I taught biology in the high school.
Except transitional species exist. Just to remind ourselves, let's see some.
All those are just man's conjecture. They find a bone here and they find a bone there, and then they draw this picture connecting the two, and they teach it to the students as a fact.
Okay, let's look at some examples of in situ fossils of transitional forms, such as Elpistostega, Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, and Adelatherium. Notice how these aren't bones scattered miles away, but are obviously associated, and in some cases even in articulation. Fossil species, both obviously transitional and not, are not composed of bones scattered all over the place, and therefore likely to be chimerical. Now that's not to say a bone is never misidentified as being part of a particular individual when it wasn't, but that's also something that's checked for, as in the case of that one vertebral element in Lucy that turns out not to have been hers.
Say, if you don't believe that, you're ignorant. It's just man's idea.
Again, but look at the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx and tell me that that whole animal is just some human invention.
It's not backed up. Nobody observed this one becoming that one, right?
Yes, and no one has observed a redwood seed growing into a 126-meter tall behemoth. But we have seen all the stages in between, and we have well understood mechanisms for how it happens, so it's a pretty safe bet that Hyperion, the tallest known tree in the world, started at some point as a seed, and a fairly small one at that.
Observation is what real science is. So these are made up, so what we'll never find a bird dog.
Yes, that would violate the rules of evolution. It's good to see that we're going full crocoduck. Evolution precludes the natural occurrences of transitions between separate extant lineages. Instead, the ancestors of any two organisms wouldn't be the same organism as either of them. In this case, the most common ancestor of a bird and a dog would be the first amniote population, and they would have looked a bit like lizards, although they wouldn't actually be lizards, as lizards also have numerous specializations, but those to the human eye would not likely be very noticeable from the outside. I'm going to skip over his series of crocoduck analogs, including the cow dog, the tiger bunny, the tiger cow, the zebra kangaroo, and the butterfly cat. It's just different photoshopped animals, some well done, that makes the same point I addressed. Good to know that young Earth creationists in the pews are getting such rigorous strawmen. But with that, we're actually going to cut it off for now. We have a whole lot more to go through. I am barely a quarter of the way done with this video, and it's going to be quite a wild ride because I have already seen this whole video. Anyway, if you like this video, please do hit like, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and if you are subscribed, make sure you turn on the bell notification button so that you're always notified when there's new Dapper Dinosaur content. Please do leave a comment telling me if you like this video, and if you didn't like it, leave me a comment telling me what I did wrong and what I can do better in the future. Anyway, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Ben Tovand, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Knoll, Sphincter of Doom, Starrunner, and Patrick Dennis. It's because of my channel members and patrons that this channel can keep on going at the blistering pace of 2 to 3 and almost always 3 uploads per week. And because I do run this channel at a slight loss, it is very important that anyone who can afford to and really likes my content, please do consider joining the Patreon or joining the channel with the link below. Patreon link is in the description. On Patreon, you can join at a 10% discount if you join for an annual subscription. And if for some reason you can't afford it, or an annual or monthly pledge isn't for you, there are always other ways to help out the channel. There's an Amazon wishlist linked in the description. There's also a merch store full of almost everything that Teespring makes,